If there was one thing, only one thing, President Trump has done good for Canada, he woke us up. He woke us up and he's united us. So that's the best thing President Trump could have ever done.
Canada delivered a message today that Washington won't easily forget. No hesitation, no diplomatic sugarcoating, just one of the sharpest lines of the year from Ontario Premier Doug Ford. Trump woke us up. He united us. Coming from a figure who is often aligned with conservative circles in the United States, this wasn't just a passing comment, it was a political marker. And it signals a deeper shift underway. Canada is no longer reacting to Donald Trump, it's preparing for him. Ford made these remarks as Canada steps into 2026 with uncertainty still radiating out of the White House. President Donald Trump has once again tied immigration, drug trafficking, critical minerals, and even Greenland into his political messaging, areas that touch directly on Canada's security and economic interests. At the same time, the United States is bracing for a possible Supreme Court ruling that could unravel a massive portion of Trump's emergency tariff authority, a decision that could force billions in refunds and shake North American supply chains. In this climate, Ford's message stood out. Canada has no reason to fear Donald Trump. Instead, he argues that Trump's unpredictability forced Canada to do something it should have done years ago: diversify its markets, strengthen domestic unity, and rethink the assumption that stability in Washington is guaranteed. He recalled the chaos of early 2025 when Trump returned to power and Ottawa was still forming its new government. Tariffs surged, attacks escalated, and Canada was left trying to understand a rule book that no longer made sense. By the end of that year, Ford says, Canada had learned the real rule. There are no rules with Trump. And that realization has become a strategic weapon. Ford's comments land at a moment when Canada is fundamentally re-engineering its place in global trade. Trump's tariff blitz, still being contested in U.S. courts, has destabilized traditional supply chains and pushed Canadian exporters to seek stability elsewhere. Yet instead of folding under pressure, Canada adapted. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, the country has spent the past year building partnerships across the Indo-Pacific, expanding industrial cooperation with South Korea, reopening high-level engagement with China, and repositioning itself in European markets. What Ford said today confirms a reality quietly shaping Canada's strategy. Trump's volatility has become the catalyst for a more independent Canadian economy. Ford's now viral metaphor that North America is an omelet that can only grow larger illustrates the pragmatic view driving Canadian policy. No U.S. president, not even Trump, can unravel decades of integration without harming his own economy. American refineries still rely on Canadian crude for nearly 70% of their heavy oil supply. U.S. automakers depend on Canadian aluminum. Border states rely on Canadian electricity. It is structural, not symbolic. Ford's confidence doesn't come from defiance, it comes from math. Canada is not the junior partner in a fragile relationship. It is a supplier the U.S. cannot easily replace. A year ago, Ford admits, Canada felt unsteady. New government, new tariffs, new dynamics, and no clarity on how far Trump would go. Today, that hesitation is gone. Canada is no longer making a pitch to the U.S. explaining why Americans should buy Canadian goods. Instead, Canada is building leverage so the U.S. cannot afford not to. The rise in exports to Asia and Europe, the clean energy incentives that now rival America's IRA framework, and the renewed diplomatic push in the Arctic all point in the same direction. Canada isn't repositioning itself because it dislikes Trump's approach, it's repositioning itself because the old structure can no longer be trusted. As Trump prepares for the 2026 USMCA review, he is not facing the fragmented, reactive Canada he encountered during the first months of his second term. He is facing a Canada that has reduced its trade concentration in the U.S. to the lowest level since the late 1990s, a Canada that has strengthened ties with South Korea, Japan, China, and the EU, and a Canada that is no longer emotionally or economically anchored to Washington. This is the subtext of Ford's message. Trump may still wield tariffs, but Canada is no longer standing still.
Ford's shift is notable because he isn't a natural Trump critic. His political base includes many who once admired Trump's blunt style. So when Ford speaks this candidly and with this much confidence, it reveals something important about Canada's domestic landscape. Pushing back against Trump is no longer a partisan gesture. It is becoming a national expectation. And Ford's emphasis on unity between provincial and federal governments signals that Canada understands the scale of the moment. Its economic future cannot hinge on the political turbulence of a single foreign leader. His statement that Trump united us is not rhetorical flourish. It is a sign that Canada's internal politics are aligning around a simple truth. A volatile United States requires a more independent Canada.
There are no rules with President Trump. So as we move forward throughout the year, and as we move forward for this year, we're going to focus on what we can do to continue to thrive and prosper, how we can work collaboratively with all the provincial governments and the federal government as well.
Ford's final insight that there are no rules with Trump is already shaping Canadian strategy. The country is designing trade policy with built-in alternatives, pursuing energy projects with geopolitical foresight, fortifying its Arctic posture amid renewed U.S. interest in Greenland, and elevating partnerships that are not contingent on Washington's approval. Trump wanted leverage. Instead, he may have created something else, a Canada that is structurally less dependent on American certainty, because that certainty no longer exists. Each of these shifts reinforces Ford's broader point. The Trump era no longer destabilizes Canada the way it once did. It pressures Canada to evolve, and Canada is evolving quickly.
Ford's message today is not simply about trade or tariffs. It is about identity. Canada has stepped out of the reactive mindset that defined the first months of Trump's return to power. It is acting with purpose, with diversification, and with a new understanding of its own strategic weight. Trump may escalate tariffs or push for a hardened USMCA rewrite. He may revive the Greenland storyline or widen his national security arguments around minerals, but Canada is no longer waiting for the next move. The real question as we approach a critical 2026 is this: now that Trump has woken Canada up, how far will Canada go to chart a path where the United States is no longer the center of gravity?
Canada's new government will rebuild, reinvest, and rearm the Canadian Armed Forces.
The Prime Minister's clarion call to defend against a superpower's imperialism.
What I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state. We give them protection, military protection.
Donald Trump turned his threats into a trade war, pushing Mark Carney to turn the military into an economic shield.
I'm announcing today that Canada will achieve NATO's 2% of GDP target this year, half a decade ahead of schedule.
Canada just delivered a message that Washington did not expect to hear so soon, and certainly not so clearly. Prime Minister Mark Carney has launched the most significant military reinvestment in modern Canadian history, an overhaul driven not by distant threats from Russia or China, but by something far closer: rising sovereignty tensions with the United States under Donald Trump's second-term trade war. This is the moment few imagined possible. Canada is rearming to protect its economic future from its closest ally, and Trump can no longer pretend the old imbalance still holds.
Standing in Ottawa, Carney declared that Canada will meet NATO's 2% defense spending benchmark this year, a target long criticized as out of reach. What makes this extraordinary is that Canada is hitting the goal 5 years ahead of schedule. Carney's budget injects more than $82 billion into defense over the next 5 years, rebuilding a force stretched thin by decades of underinvestment. The plan includes hiring and training more soldiers, improving pay for those serving abroad or in the Arctic, modernizing Canada's surveillance and patrol capabilities, and making Arctic sovereignty a national priority. But the real shift lies in how Canada intends to spend this money. For decades, 3/4 of Canadian defense procurement flowed straight into the United States. Now, Carney is ending that era. He announced that Canada will no longer be sending 75 cents of every procurement dollar south, signaling a redirection of contracts toward Canadian companies and toward reliable partners in Europe and Asia. That transition is already visible. Germany and Norway are competing with South Korea to build Canada's next submarine fleet, a contract worth more than $100 billion when counting manufacturing and half a century of maintenance. Sweden has launched its own charm offensive, offering to build Gripen fighter jets directly in Canada, and Ottawa is openly reconsidering whether it will buy more American F-35s after Trump's tariffs raised costs and reduced the industrial benefits promised to Canadians. In other words, Canada is not just rebuilding its military, it is redesigning its entire strategic posture.
Carney's move is not a symbolic upgrade. It is a strategic correction to the economic reality that Trump created. When the United States began slapping aggressive tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, autos, and even clean tech components, Ottawa realized something fundamental. If Washington can weaponize trade, then Canada must strengthen the tools that protect its economy. Carney is reframing national defense as an economic shield, a way to ensure Canada cannot be coerced through tariffs, trade disruptions, or political unpredictability. This recalibration arrives at a moment when Trump's tariffs are tearing North America's supply chain from the inside out. His promise to renationalize production in the U.S. is colliding with industrial reality. In Michigan, the CEO of Alpha USA, a mid-size auto parts supplier, now warns his business faces an existential threat because the components they need, many sourced from Taiwan and other Asian markets, have become too expensive under Trump's tariff regime. They cannot switch to U.S. components because those alternatives do not exist.
This single story captures the wider truth. The auto supply chain is too integrated to be rebuilt by political force. For decades, Canadian, American, Mexican, and Asian producers have operated as one ecosystem. When tariffs hit one link, the shock ripples across the entire system. Trump may score political points by forcing Stellantis to preserve a shift in Michigan, but long-term investment decisions across the continent are being frozen. Small suppliers are struggling, corporate planning is on pause, and North America's once predictable manufacturing base is drifting into uncertainty. Carney understands that markets hate chaos. His brand is stability, rules that do not change overnight, frameworks that investors can trust, and economic leadership that does not rely on bluster or punishment. His military reinvestment is an extension of that idea. A sovereign Canada, with its own industrial base and its own defense infrastructure, is a Canada that cannot be bullied by tariff diplomacy.
This shift matters even more in the Arctic, where climate change is opening new maritime routes and accelerating competition from Russia and China. For decades, Canada's Arctic defenses lagged behind its ambitions. Now, Carney is pouring resources into northern patrols, surveillance systems, and the submarine fleet needed to guarantee that Canada, not the U.S., not Russia, not China, controls the waters surrounding its northern frontier. And it is here that one of the most overlooked factors emerges, the economic value of the Arctic itself. As sea lanes open and resource potential grows, the region becomes a future trade corridor connecting Europe and Asia. By boosting Arctic defense, Canada isn't only projecting sovereignty, it is protecting future export routes and mineral access that could redefine the nation's economic map.
This adds a layer of urgency Washington cannot ignore, because a more capable Canada in the Arctic limits America's freedom to maneuver in a region it once assumed would default to U.S. oversight. And this is where the political symbolism becomes impossible for Trump to ignore. Earlier this year, Trump joked that Canada could be America's 51st state. It was meant to be lighthearted, but Canadians did not laugh. The remark landed in the middle of a tariff war. It reminded Ottawa that sovereignty is not something Canada can take for granted, and it strengthened Carney's case that national defense, economic independence, and Arctic control must be treated as one integrated project. This transformation also reflects a new geopolitical reality. Canada is diversifying away from the United States. Carney wants to double non-U.S. exports within a decade, deepen industrial ties with Europe and Asia, and reduce Canada's exposure to Washington's political volatility. The submarine and fighter jet competitions now show this clearly. Canada is no longer buying American equipment because it always has. It is choosing partners based on long-term strategic value, stable supply chains, and mutual benefit. For the first time in decades, Washington cannot assume automatic compliance from Ottawa. And that shift, more than the spending, more than the submarines, is what makes Carney's move so significant.
Carney's defense reinvestment is more than a budget line. It marks a turning point in the Canada-U.S. relationship. Canada is no longer relying on American goodwill to safeguard its sovereignty or its economy. Instead, it is building a strategic foundation that protects Canadian interests even when Washington chooses confrontation over cooperation. As Trump intensifies tariffs, disrupts supply chains, and injects political volatility into the North American marketplace, Canada is quietly constructing a shield, economic, industrial, and military, that ensures it cannot be pushed around. And so the real question now is this: if Canada is no longer dependent on the United States, how will Washington adapt to a North America where Ottawa is not the junior partner, but a sovereign power ready to defend its interests with confidence and with force?
We are going to build big. Because we're going to build big and build often, it's a little more than $80 billion between now and the end of the decade. Now, as much as possible, we will concentrate that on areas where there is dual-use applications. AI is an example, critical minerals is another example, decarbonization, a number of those technologies are there.
Mark Carney has just delivered one of the most revealing interviews of his premiership, and it exposed something Washington did not expect. While Donald Trump has spent months trying to force Canada back into dependency through tariffs, intimidation, and economic threats, Carney calmly sat on stage in Calgary and explained, with almost unsettling composure, exactly why those tactics have no hold over Canada anymore. There were no theatrics, no raised voices, no political jabs, yet somehow the quiet tone made the message even louder. Canada has moved on, Trump's leverage is shrinking, and the world has begun to notice. This video breaks down how a single interview revealed why Trump's pressure strategy has failed and why Canada is entering a new phase of strategic independence that Washington can no longer ignore.
So when you look at it from an energy perspective, we start with our strengths, oil and gas, conventional, but also the innovations that we've done. We have one of the cleanest grids in the world, 80% plus clean power across the country, hydro, nuclear at the core of that. We have the ability to double, possibly triple that over the course of the next 15 years.
What was supposed to be a standard conversation about LNG, energy grids, and infrastructure quickly turned into a declaration of direction for Canada. Carney confirmed that Canada intends to double its non-U.S. exports by 2030 and expand its energy capacity across LNG, nuclear, hydro, low-carbon oil, and hydrogen. He spoke about building an AI ecosystem that isn't dependent on American hyperscalers, a national research architecture strengthened by a $1.7 billion plan to attract top global researchers, and a broader industrial renewal built on critical minerals, domestic processing, and applied R&D. The moment that sent shockwaves through policy circles in Washington came when Carney said, almost casually, we do need to have greater diversification. He made it clear that although the United States remains an important partner, Canada is no longer willing to hinge its economic future on a country whose trade policy changes with every political mood swing. Trump believed Canada had no choice but to accept Washington's demands, but the interview revealed that Canada has already built the escape routes and is walking through them confidently.
For more than a year, Trump has tried to drag Canada back into economic submission by weaponizing tariffs across steel, autos, clean energy components, and lumber. His team assumed that Canada, deeply tied to the U.S. market, would eventually fold. But Carney's interview showed that those tariffs didn't weaken Canada, they accelerated its pivot away from U.S. dependence. Canada used the turbulence to justify an ambitious industrial overhaul. Ottawa accelerated critical mineral development, unlocked new LNG export corridors, negotiated new trade pathways across Asia and Europe, and secured deeper partnerships with South Korea and Japan. Instead of intimidating Canada, Trump inadvertently pushed it to diversify faster than at any point in the last 40 years. It is difficult to overstate the miscalculation. Trump expected fear. Instead, he sparked strategy. Carney's explanation of Canada's future energy landscape was perhaps the most damaging blow to Washington's assumptions. He described a country with one of the cleanest grids on the planet, powered by hydro and nuclear, and capable of doubling or even tripling its clean generation capacity. He spoke of LNG projects built on low-carbon foundations, hydrogen pathways being commercialized, nuclear expansion underway, and interprovincial energy corridors that would reshape the national grid. In contrast, the United States under Trump is swinging between extremes, blocking offshore wind projects, undermining clean energy credits, and igniting uncertainty for renewable developers. Carney positioned Canada as the dependable supplier in a world that is desperate for stable, low-risk energy. Reliability, not volume, is becoming the new currency of global power, and by that definition, Canada is rising just as the U.S. is becoming more unpredictable.
A recurring theme in Carney's interview was the quiet but decisive shift happening in Canada's resource strategy. Instead of exporting raw materials and letting other countries control processing, Canada is now building its own processing capacity, especially in Quebec and Ontario. This reduces dependence on China, but has an equally profound effect on Canada's relationship with the United States. It eliminates one of Trump's favorite pressure points. Washington has long assumed that Canada needs the U.S. market to monetize its mineral resources. But by controlling both the extraction and the processing, Canada no longer has to accept American terms. Mineral supply chains backed by G7 partnerships and EU investment give Canada more choices and fewer vulnerabilities. Trump can tariff aluminum or steel, but he cannot tariff an industry Canada now controls from the ground all the way up the value chain.
One of the most striking moments in the interview came when Carney acknowledged that Canada historically loses many of its best AI graduates to the United States. But instead of accepting this as inevitable, he laid out a plan to reverse the trend, a new productivity superdeduction that makes R&D and data infrastructure far more attractive inside Canada. A Canadian DARPA-style agency called Borealis, a billion-dollar competition to attract 1,000 world-class researchers, and a strategy to lure highly skilled workers who are frustrated by U.S. visa chaos. In other words, while Trump erects barriers, Carney is opening doors. The U.S. is shrinking its talent pool, Canada is expanding its own. And in the global competition for AI leadership, the country that attracts the most minds wins, not the country that yells the loudest.
Carney ended the conversation with a line that summarizes the new era Canada is entering. We are going to build big because we are going to build big and build often. He was talking about community infrastructure, energy megaprojects, national grids, ports in Nunavut, training centers, and the trades-based workforce needed to build a new generation of national assets. But behind the policy detail was a deeper message. Canada is no longer waiting for Washington's permission to grow. It is building its own economy, its own export routes, and its own technological base, and that means Trump's leverage is evaporating.
The United States can pressure a dependent country. It cannot pressure a self-sufficient one.
Carney's interview wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't attack Trump directly, but it didn't have to. The quiet confidence of his answers revealed that Canada is entering a phase where U.S. pressure simply doesn't work anymore. With a diversified export strategy, a rising clean energy platform, a controlled mineral supply chain, a revitalized research ecosystem, and a talent strategy that turns America's immigration turmoil into Canada's opportunity, the old dynamics no longer apply. So the real question, and the one Canada's allies and rivals are now asking, is simple. If Canada continues to rise at this pace, what happens when Washington realizes it no longer holds the senior partner position in this relationship? Canada's transformation has already begun. Trump just hasn't caught up to it.
Another renewable energy source could soon be coming to the forefront in Canada. Near the beginning of November, Max Power Mining Corporation successfully drilled Canada's first dedicated natural hydrogen well near Central Butte. The company's incoming CEO says energy is like a buffet, with every sector playing its part.
Canada just pulled off something big, something that could redefine the entire balance of power in North American energy. While Washington is still arguing about tariffs, drilling leases, and whether EVs are patriotic enough, Canada quietly drilled the country's first natural hydrogen well in Saskatchewan. And unlike the usual political theater, this move actually means something. It's practical, it's strategic, and it places Canada ahead in a race most countries haven't even realized has started. Natural hydrogen, the kind generated underground by geological processes, has long been treated like a scientific curiosity. The U.S. Geological Survey has published maps showing America has promising zones, but U.S. companies haven't moved past early exploration. Canada, meanwhile, did it. A functioning well, real data, and a team preparing for commercial flow tests. In the middle of a trade war climate where the U.S. is weaponizing tariffs, pushing allies into corners, and demanding supply chain obedience, Canada just opened a door into a new source of clean, scalable, and potentially exportable energy. This wasn't just a drilling operation. It was a message. Canada is building its own future.
In early November, Max Power Mining Corporation completed Canada's first dedicated natural hydrogen well outside central Saskatchewan. The well reached over 2 kilometers deep and hit multiple hydrogen-bearing zones. For a long time, geologists debated whether natural hydrogen existed underground in usable quantities. Saskatchewan just proved that it does. The chief geoscientist behind the project described natural hydrogen exploration as a chess match, the kind that rewards patience, skill, and an understanding that the Earth doesn't give up its secrets easily. Max Power now has 6 additional concept sites ready for evaluation, with the company preparing a full round of flow testing to confirm commercial viability. The timing couldn't be more remarkable. Canada's energy system is already one of the cleanest in the world, with an 85% clean electricity grid powered by hydro, nuclear, and growing renewable capacity. Prime Minister Mark Carney has spent the past year promoting a diversified, Asia-oriented trade strategy as the U.S. under President Donald Trump doubles down on tariffs, protectionism, and demands for allies to fall in line. Now Canada has stumbled upon a resource that could speed up the energy transition, power AI-driven data centers, reduce water usage, and eventually become a new export sector. All at the moment the U.S. is squeezing neighbors with 25 to 100% tariffs and threatening new import restrictions. Hydrogen wasn't supposed to be part of the political story, but now it is.
While America debates which state should host the next oil lease, Canada is doing what innovators do, moving first. Natural hydrogen is still a frontier resource. The world has barely scratched the surface. But leadership matters. The country that proves the resource is real will shape the standards, the technology, and eventually the market. Today, that country is Canada. The United States has geological potential, but no major company has drilled a purpose-built hydrogen well to full depth. Canada has. And in geopolitics, the difference between might be possible and we already did it is enormous. Trump's second term has made one thing clear: energy and trade are now the same battlefield. The U.S. has slapped tariffs on Canadian steel, lumber, aluminum, autos, and now even trucks and agricultural goods. The message is simple: Washington wants leverage. But leverage only works when the other country depends on you. Canada developing a new source of clean domestic energy weakens that dependence. Natural hydrogen could support heavy industry, AI data centers, export corridors to Asia, or even clean fuel markets in Europe, all while reducing Canada's vulnerability to U.S. supply disruptions. It's not that hydrogen will replace oil tomorrow, but markets move on signals, and the signal from Saskatchewan is that Canada is not standing still. Mark Carney has spent 2025 building new partnerships across South Korea, Japan, ASEAN, and China. APEC 2025 made one thing clear: Asia is opening its door to Canadian energy, technology, and supply chains. Natural hydrogen fits into that pivot beautifully. South Korea just signed a defense industrial partnership with Canada. Japan is expanding clean tech investment. China wants to reset relations and is hungry for cleaner fuels. A future hydrogen exporter with political stability and environmental credibility, that is a role Canada is perfectly positioned to play. And it is a role the United States cannot block with tariffs. Historically, America dominates new energy markets. From shale oil to LNG exports, the U.S. usually moves first and forces others to catch up. But natural hydrogen is different. The U.S. has maps, draft policies, and pilot projects, but no major commercial drilling success story. Canada now holds the milestone. With Washington locked in tariff disputes, angry refinery lobbying, and political battles over environmental rules, the U.S. is distracted. Clean energy investors notice, artificial intelligence firms notice, data center developers notice, especially since natural hydrogen could dramatically reduce water use compared to cooling today's AI clusters. A Canada that can power next-generation computing without relying on U.S. gas or U.S. political unpredictability becomes a very attractive partner. Let's be honest. Canadians have taken one hit after another this year. Jeep production moved south. Trump imposed more tariffs. GM shut its Ontario electric van line. Washington has tried to use energy as leverage repeatedly. And then suddenly, Canada scores a clean tech win entirely on its own soil. No U.S. subsidy, no White House pressure, no multinational dictating the terms. Just Canadian geologists, Canadian land, Canadian innovation, and a well that may open the door to a brand new industry. For a country often framed as reacting to U.S. decisions, this is a rare and welcome reversal.
Canada's first natural hydrogen well is more than a scientific breakthrough. It is a statement of intent. While the United States leans deeper into protectionism and tariff leverage, Canada is building the industries of the future: clean energy, AI-ready infrastructure, and Asia-connected trade routes. If commercial tests succeed, Canada will not only gain a new domestic resource, it will gain bargaining power, it will gain independence, and it will gain credibility as a country capable of leading, not waiting. So the real question is simple. If this is what Canada can achieve with its first hydrogen well, what happens when the next 6 come online? Because for the first time in a long time, Canada isn't following. Canada is setting the pace.